But anyways, it's very encouraging to see the number of people that are interested by all means, because there's been times when there's barely been enough to cover the election ballot. So I don't know. I guess all I can say is that it's a very rewarding process, and you have to be prepared to put your heart into this whole process. Otherwise, don't do it. If you haven't, I've heard of people that have gone into these things with got a focused special agenda at the end, and I've yet to see that happen. I've heard that apparently happen on occasion, but I've never seen it. I've been in a municipal council for 23 out of the last, I think, 33 years, and there's nobody. I've never really seen anybody that's done that. But of course, everybody's kind of got their pet peeve that their reason they're kind of running for council, that they want to see more recreation, they want to see more housing, they want to, and this type, and those are all great. That's what we need all the time, is fresh ideas. But I just encourage everybody to be on the positive side, do it for the right reasons, and you'll find it very rewarding. But there's a big commitment, to do that. But anyways, I'm encouraged to see the caliber of people that are here, Ian, tonight. There's some very good candidates. I think they do a great job on council. So, and last but not least, we've developed a fairly stringent code of conduct for councillors. It's something that's been in the works in a lesser, minor level or degree in the past, but we just kind of revisited the whole thing about council and what people, where they put you, class you when you're on council, and what's expected of you, and this type of thing. So the code of conduct, I'm sure you've all had a chance to look at it, but it's I think it's a well placed product that a lot of councils have had input over the years. So anyways, have a good look at that. It's a pretty enlightening process, that code of conduct. So welcome everybody. I'll shut up now and let Ian take over.
Thanks, Mayor Romaine. Again, thanks for all you participating tonight. My name is Todd Becker. I'm the town's Chief Administrative Officer. And this is a partnership between the Town of Innisfail and the Chamber of Commerce. The intent, and I'll get into it a little bit more, is actually to allow people that have an interest in looking or considering running for election at the municipal level to kind of get a little bit more information to help you understand what that might look like for you based upon your successful election. And I, as the town CAO, I've been in the community just shy of 4 years, actually. Right before this, the most recent election, I was fortunate to be placed, appointed as the CAO with the Town of Innisfail, hired by council, and fortunate to be serving the community for almost those 4 years. So yeah, you always hope as a CAO that the council feels as fortunate as I do. And I'll certainly focusing on the next council to come in and work with council to set that strategic focus and moving things forward based on the vision of council. So we pulled Ian in through strategic steps in his company. Ian has worked with us a little bit, but Ian comes to us as a certified consultant. Actually, he's telling us before this session started that he's written a book. He's working on a second book based on municipal governance, and you'll hear some of those references, I would believe, in some of his delivery to you. But the intent again is to help give you the tools coming in based on a successful election, of course, or if you wish to serve the community in different ways. So Ian has significant experiences with different sectors, but I know Ian more so through the municipal sector, working both in governance and organizational excellence. So just want to welcome you, Ian, as I do with the rest of the participants. So this should be a fun evening. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mr. Becker, and members of council and guests. I agree with Mayor Romain. It's really good to see so many people here who are out. I think he may have said kicking the tires to identify whether this is something that you would like to pursue. This is, I think, the first election we have put a concerted effort into providing some of these council candidate orientations. We do a lot of after the election orientations, but for people who are interested in kind of knowing what the job is, this is a great opportunity. So, I mean, this is not ideal that it's virtual. I'd much rather be in a room with you all and have a good conversation back and forth. That's just the way we're all living at the moment. So what I would like to say, though, is I would like this to be somewhat conversational. You are not going to want to sit there and listen to me for 2 hours or an hour and a half or whatever it turns out to be with questions. So if you do have questions, please either pipe up or put something in the chat box, and we'll stop kind of at the end of each one of the subsections of what we're going to talk about today. And we can have a bit of a conversation about it. If you've got questions, we can answer some of those questions as well. There is one other person here in the session I would like to point out, and that is Ben Prue, who works with me. And I'm just going to ask Ben to keep an eye on that chat too, because sometimes if I get rolling, sometimes I miss those sorts of things. So without further ado then, what we are going to cover tonight, this is our agenda for the evening. I will tell you as well that I will provide these slides to the town following the session tonight. And we'll ask then that they be emailed out to you at the end of the evening. So you're welcome to take notes if you want, but you'll get a copy of these if you want as well. So on our agenda for this evening, we're going to kind of start at the top and work our way down. I'd like to find a little bit from you in terms of what you would like to see out of the session. I'll give you a little bit of an outline on kind of what gives me the authority or the right to be providing this to you. I'd like to talk about legislation, some really interesting stuff. I really love this stuff, so if I drone on about it, you'll have to understand. Legislation starting from the Canadian Constitution all the way down to municipal bylaws and policies. We'll talk about the difference between governance and administration, management if you like. The expectations that you might have of the role and of the role of you and of the community. Pitfalls that we see when we are engaged with communities that sometimes aren't working at their best. What you might have in terms of workload and expectations, and I'd be quite interested for the current members of council to pipe in on that too, because each community is a little bit different in terms of what they expect, the amount of time and involvement from each member of council. And we're also in a time of COVID too, and that changes things quite a lot. A reference to just the beginning of the session, Todd and I were having a conversation about some resources. We've got some literature resources and some websites for you too. And as you get copies of this, this presentation, you'll get the copies, obviously, of those resources as well. And then we'll just do a wrap up. The goal for today is to have a conversation about the role of municipal councillor, one of whom will end up is the mayor, but the mayor, of course, is just a member of council like any other with some additional responsibilities. That's what we're going to talk about. We'll glance a little bit on elections because that's how you get there. But this session isn't kind of a how you should campaign sort of a thing. If you've got questions about that, as they have in other sessions like this, I'm happy to help you out with that as well. Todd referenced who I am. I run a company called Strategic Steps. We operate in the space between elected officials and senior managers in municipalities. We operate most of the time in Alberta, but the last normal year we had, which I think was 2019, we worked in 3 or 4 Western Canadian provinces. We worked in a couple of territories, and we worked in a couple of states as well, all in the realm of governance on the local governance level. So I had an interesting time in Nunavut a couple of years ago. Got snowed in a blizzard in Rankin Inlet on the northwest coast of Hudson's Bay, and was up there doing a presentation for an orientation actually for all the newly elected mayors in Nunavut. And the joke we have there, I got stuck. I overnighted in Rankin Inlet for 5 days. And it was at that time that my one of my associates sent me a list of things that I talk about, and she said, here's your book table of contents. So I did actually write a book. It's called Who's Driving the Grader? It's available through Municipal World, and it's all about governance stories, the principles of good governance from a Canadian and a local level. When we are asked to come in and help with this sort of governance stuff, we often follow, well, we do follow the election cycle. So now, of course, we're doing these sorts of presentations to municipalities or regions around the province of people who are interested or thinking about running for council. Following that, we have booked quite a few orientations. The Municipal Government Act requires every municipality to put on an orientation within 90 days of the election. So we've been booked to do some of those. And in fact, I was just speaking to the Alberta Municipal Clerks Association conference earlier today on that very topic. Following that, we're often engaged in strategic planning for municipalities. We have worked with Innisfail in the past in that way as well. Governance reviews, organizational reviews. If a municipality isn't working quite right, sometimes we get brought in to have a bit of a review of that, an analysis, and some recommendations about how to get the place back on its feet. We're just doing one of those at the moment in the town of Kalmar, just outside Edmonton. And then reviews of codes of conduct. The mayor referenced the code of conduct that is still relatively new as a requirement for municipalities in Alberta. And sometimes it's what it is, it gives members of council an opportunity to challenge the way things are being done. We're actually currently engaged in a review of a code of conduct complaint in the town of Strathmore, just outside Calgary. And we just wrapped one up with the town of Colehurst, just outside Lethbridge. So sometimes we get involved in those sorts of things. So I mentioned those are kind of in the election cycle. We have actually just finished doing some strategic planning in Saskatchewan because they are on an election cycle a year ahead of us. And so we did orientations in Saskatchewan last fall too. So what that gives us the ability to do is see what happens in various jurisdictions around Canada for the most part, although I have done an orientation in California as well, which is quite fascinating. But it gives us that opportunity to bring to you examples from other places. I find that best practice, you may have best practices in any given municipality, but oftentimes looking further afield is quite a useful thing to do. So that's a little bit about what I do and what we talk about. I wouldn't mind hearing from you a little bit, if I scribble a few notes here, about some of the things that you might want to know by the end of tonight's workshop. Does anybody want to say anything? And we'll try and make sure we capture some of the things that you would like to see, because this is really, really for you more than it is for me. I know this stuff. What would you like to see by the end of the evening? If you want to unmute yourself and just let me know. Anybody, if you want to. If nobody has any expectations, I can easily meet those. Jason, go ahead. I can't see everybody on my screen, so you might just have to butt in. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks. I'm looking at, I like the agenda. I think this is really good compared to 4 years ago. I think 4 years ago there was a bit of a session, but I think this is really well structured. My question today would be, what kind of educational opportunities for those who would be elected? That would be mine. Thanks.
Thanks. We will, in fact, cover that in terms of some of the things that are available to you provincially or even locally as well. Was there anybody else? I appreciate being polite and raising your hand, but if there's anything you want to say, that's great. All right. We consultants are trained to wait 5 seconds before we move on. So if you do have something that you want to expand on that we're having a conversation about, please do ask. So we're going to start off with legislation. And after I'm done this subsection, we'll just stop and see if anybody has any questions about that. Again, you're welcome to track them in the chat if you want. You're welcome just to ask if you like as well. So we'll start at the top. The Canadian Constitution governs everything that has to do with all orders of government in Canada. All it says about local government throughout the country is that local governments are the responsibilities of the various provinces and territories. Practically what that means is each province and territory manages or controls local government in a slightly different way. So if you've recently moved from Saskatchewan, you would notice that we don't have something called rural municipalities. If you moved from BC, you would notice we don't have something called regional districts. And if you went to any of those places, the word county wouldn't mean anything to them. But for practical purposes, if we're dealing with a town like Innisfail, Those are fairly similar in structure across the country, although they do differ in terms of population. Typically, a town would be between 1,000 and 10,000 people, and so you fit nicely within that realm. This also means that the Constitution is silent on the relationship between the various provincial governments and the municipalities that live within them. So we get things like downloading happening from the province to municipalities. Unfortunately, you can't upload, and there's nobody else to download to. So that means that local governments sometimes fill in the void in places the province or the federal government has left an opening. But so for intents and purposes, that's the role. One of the practical things with this, though, is that some of the changes that we would like to make, or people would like to make to local government, can't be made by the local government because it requires provincial or federal changes. For example, we hear conversation from time to time about the desire for term limits. You should have 8 years and then you're done, like they do in the United States. You can't do that in Canada at the local level. You can voluntarily serve 2 terms and then leave, but nobody can make you leave after 2, because that would require changes at the federal or provincial level and would likely result in some sort of a challenge against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms anyway. If you look provincially at provincially, the legislation that we deal with mostly is the Municipal Government Act, or MGA. The MGA is the governing rules for all of municipalities in the province. It's the second largest piece of legislation in Alberta after the Insurance Act, of all things. It establishes municipalities, it gives the ability to modify municipalities, and it gives the right of the province to dissolve municipalities as well. So by modify, what I mean is change a village to a town, change a town to a city, or go back, or to dissolve them if they are no longer sustainable. An urban municipality could dissolve back into its surrounding rural municipality. And that's been happening a bit recently. We've seen that a few years ago in places like Lac La Biche, more recently in places like the village of Wabamun, west of Edmonton, and the village of Granham, just north of Fort Macleod. So those kind of places have changed. Excuse me. The MGA also creates councils as bodies of odd numbers of individuals to represent the communities. It establishes the role of councillor, the role of mayor, the role of reeve in a rural municipality. It provides a skeleton for rules around council meetings themselves, although that is fleshed out more significantly locally too. It provides decision-making authority to council and some decision-making authority to the office of the Chief Administrative Officer, or CAO, as well. There are lots of other parts to the MGA that don't really affect how councils operate. I think technical pieces around the creation and dissolution of communities, or zoning, though there is certainly some impact on zoning. Some other pieces around things like municipal government boards, or growth management boards that you'd see around in Edmonton or Calgary. You are probably quite familiar with the Local Authorities Elections Act, or LAEA, if you are seriously considering running for office. That act sets the provincial rules for elections, including how you are eligible to run. You have to meet a particular set of criteria to be able to stand for office within a community, including actually living in the community, which you would be surprised is the local order of government is the only order of government in Alberta in which you actually have to live in the community that you represent. MPs and MLAs don't have to live in the riding or constituency. There's a lot more details in bylaw around the elections. Things just associated with funding and fundraising show up in the LAEA as well, and there was some recent contention about that. Another act you probably become familiar with is Voip, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. This shows up when councillors are talking about transparency a lot, and transparency talks about what kind of information do we release to the public. And there are rules about when you have to do your business in public, i.e. release information. There are also exceptions to disclosure as well about when information must be kept private or confidential. And that begins to identify what the type of information, type of content you would have in a closed session of council or an in-camera meeting, where everybody's excluded except the members of council and anybody they happen to invite, which typically includes the CAO and perhaps some other technical people, but could include others by exception as well. Looking specifically at the Municipal Government Act, this was recently changed. This is Section 3 of the MGA, and it sets out why, what the purposes are for municipalities in Alberta. There used to only be 3 purposes until fairly recently. The fundamental one is to provide good government. Now, good government is a concept more than it is anything that's defined in scripture anywhere. It talks about how a responsive government provides services to the people that it represents. You're supposed to foster the well-being of the environment. This is one of the newer sections of this part of the Municipal Government Act. And I'm not sure about the interpretation, whether it is physical environment, i.e. the land and the air and the water, or whether it is the kind of cultural environment, the way we interact with one another. You are then municipalities to provide the services that are desirable to all or part of a municipality. This becomes important with the, first of all, because it's of the opinion of council, and it folds back into that concept of good governance. It also speaks to something which is necessary or desirable for all or part of a municipality. So there may be something that is clear across town from you, which is necessary, but you as a municipality are still responsible for providing it, even if you wouldn't use it. Safe and viable community shows up here too, and community safety is obviously a big thing in most, if not all, Alberta communities, as is viability. And viability oftentimes means the ability for council to carry on, for the municipal government to continue to provide those things that are mentioned above and still be financially sustainable. And finally, this is another one of the newer parts of this part of the Municipal Government Act, working with your neighbors. You are involved in something's called Inter-Municipal Collaboration Frameworks, or ICFs, that have been required under the later stages of the NDP government, and then were changed a little bit under the newer, the earlier days of the UCP. But they're suggesting that you need to get along with your neighbors, or at least work collaboratively to provide services that are provided, that best delivered intermunicipally. This shows up in things like mutual aid agreements for emergency services, but it also shows up in recreation centers where you may or may not charge differential fees based on whether somebody is a resident of the town or whether they're a resident of a surrounding municipality. It doesn't necessarily have to be coterminal in this case, but they often are. So that's the federal and the provincial level. When we start looking at what you have, your own levers of power within municipalities, you really have 3. You have bylaws, which are your equivalent of laws that you would see at the federal or provincial level. They are the strongest piece of legislative authority that you've got. They require 3 readings, 3 independent readings of council to pass and to change. You have to use the same municipal tool to modify one of these as you did to create it. So with a bylaw, you have to use a bylaw to change it. With a policy, you have to use a policy to change it. Bylaws give you the legislative authority to do something or to prevent something and to apply some sanction to those who would contravene it. So we'll talk a bit more about some specific bylaws momentarily. Policy is a little bit more malleable, if you like. It only requires one reading, essentially, or one motion of council to make, modify, or rescind a policy. And so oftentimes, usually, a municipality will have significantly more policy than it does bylaws. The point behind policy is really to stop the CAO coming to council every time and asking the same questions. How long do you want the grass cut this month? How long do you want the grass cut this month? If you set a policy on that, it becomes predictable, and the CAO doesn't have to do that. It also provides predictability in terms of things like respectful workplaces or interrelationships between people. A lot of bylaws and policies are available on municipal websites, though not always and not all the time. If you request them, though, they are public documents and you can get them. The third lever that a municipality has or council has is around budget. You always put your money where your mouth is, and you tend to fund those things that are important. So even if a town didn't have a strategic plan, it would have essentially identified its priorities, or council would have identified priorities by where it put its money. Now, there are some things that you just have to do. You have to keep the insurance paid. You have to pay to keep the lights on in town hall, and you're probably wise to keep the fire trucks running as well. But there are other bits and pieces that show up in the budget which reflect the priorities of council. Do they or do they not fund a new park? Do they or do they not fund some sort of intermunicipal agreement with another municipality? It shows where the priorities are, whether or not they show up in the strategic plan. I've got a concept. So those are the three levers. And just a quick concept here around legislative paramountcy. Just because you want to do something and create a law to do it doesn't mean you actually have the authority to do it. So I referenced earlier that idea about term limits. If you passed a bylaw that said, well, we want term limits in Innisfail, the rule of legislative paramountcy would say that the higher order legislation would hold in that case. So the bylaw about term limits would be of no force and effect, even if you passed it. That's what legislative paramountcy is about. However, if you create a law that covers a multitude of things and only part of it contradicts a higher order level of governance, the part of it that doesn't contradict is still considered to be in force and effect. So it needs to be changed, but it's not, the baby is not thrown out with the bathwater in this case. Looking down a little bit further still at some key bylaws within the local government. Here are three that you will get familiar with if you're not already. The meeting procedure bylaw is one that you have to have for a municipality. And it's usually quite a long bylaw, and it speaks more specifically to how meetings are run, meetings of council and committee meetings are run. It picks up where the Municipal Government Act leaves off. So it speaks often to which high level, which committees there might be, the order of speaking, if you like, in council, how votes are done, all those sorts of things show up here. How committees are run, whether they're run with the same order of business as the council might be. The other thing that often shows up in meeting procedure, although less and less now, is actually the order of business for council meetings. We're seeing those move more and more from the order of business being taken out of a bylaw and put into a policy, so it can be changed. It can be changed easier. It doesn't have an impact really on how the bylaw works, but it just becomes easier for council to adapt to changing circumstances. So when we look at some of these larger bylaws, like this one, for example, we sometimes run across cases where one member of council or two members of council or a faction of council will know the bylaw better than somebody else, and will, I've heard the term weaponize policy or weaponize bylaws, and they'll use it to their advantage to get something over on other members of council. And that certainly isn't a good practice, but I have seen it done. If you want to get things done and be efficient and get business done by a reasonable hour, knowing how meeting procedure works is quite important. Sometimes we see, I saw last week, there was a St. Albert City Councillor had posted something on social media saying that she had 700 pages of reading to do before her council meeting today, perhaps, or next week. And I was trying to wonder how you would read 700 pages, internalize it all, and still be able to make good decisions. So if you want to get through all that, maybe the level of governance needs to be a little bit higher, and some of that could be in the meeting procedure. Your meetings are by default, or town council meetings are by default public meetings. Anybody can come. Council meetings, pretty much the same thing, but they are not public participation events. We sometimes see people misinterpret this as if I come to a council meeting, I can participate in the council meeting if I'm sitting in the gallery, and that's not the case. You can watch government being done and democracy in action, but you can't actually, you as a member of the gallery, can't actually participate in engaging back and forth with members of council. If you do, that typically runs against your meeting procedure bylaw. There are some times where this isn't the case. Your citizens or organizations, of course, are welcome to present to council as a delegation. They're also welcome to comment to council. Some councils will have a public input session, either on a specific topic or just a topic that's on the agenda, or some places just anything in general as a part of a public council meeting. And those are times where you can engage. But typically that engagement is one way. You tell council what you think. They may ask you questions for clarification, but often not engaging in debate. There's something called committee of the whole, where that sort of process can happen. The second key bylaw, and again, Mayor Romaine referred to this early on, is around the code of conduct. And these are becoming more and more robust over time. And they were put in place because lots of councils had a policy on conduct, but not really a lot of teeth as part of it. Very recently, the provincial government required all municipalities to develop a code of conduct bylaw. So it had some teeth. So what it was to do was to define what good behavior is, what poor behavior is, and what can happen in the case of a councillor who is found to have poor behavior. And this includes things like representing the community appropriately. It includes keeping things confidential that are supposed to be confidential. It includes the type of language that's used in council meetings as well. And as part of this, there was a requirement, I believe there's a requirement to have a complaint process in here. So if I believe a member of council, one of my council colleagues is acting inappropriately or has breached the code of conduct, I can file a complaint alleging whatever that breach might be and have somebody investigate. Most bylaws are worded such that council can investigate itself, often headed by the mayor, but council can also appoint an external or independent investigator. And sometimes that's a role we take on as like the independent third-party non-biased group. We will go in and do an analysis of the formal complaint and whatever the substance of that is. Usually we find when that happens that formal complaint is kind of the end of a link of a chain, the last link on a chain. And so just dealing with the formal complaint often doesn't address the root causes of whatever the problem was over time. And for that reason, one of the things we have suggested is that these bylaws not only have the prospect of formal complaints, but also include how we deal with an informal complaint. So before something gets bad, that there's a chance council can resolve the core of the antecedent issue before bringing someone like us in or having to do some sort of a formal investigation. These bylaws not only provide an indication of what good governance is and what poor governance looks like and the breaches of these bylaws, but they also typically provide information on the types of sanctions that are available. Now, only council itself can decide whether a complaint is upheld or not, and only council itself can then decide whether it wants to apply sanctions to one or more members of its own body. And these range from just a minor discipline like a letter, like requiring an apology, all the way up to discipline that can have a significant impact on the councillor, like removing their participation in committees. If they are remunerated separately for that, it has an impact. Requiring them to return municipal property, again, having an impact on their ability to do their jobs. Council cannot remove a member of council, however. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but there are in the disqualification end of things, but council can't remove another member of council. The third bylaw area I wanted to speak about is around public participation or consultation. And that is talking about when and how do we involve the members of the public or organizations or groups in town in the decisions that get made. Now, sometimes with some bylaws, there are open houses that are required. So there's a statutory requirement for consultation or engagement. But as we get into things like the concept of transparency again, there's a continuum of engagement that runs all the way at one end from just telling people what's going on, which might just be the news section of the town website, all the way to actually empowering another group to make a decision on behalf of council. Now, that continuum rarely goes it can't go all the way to the far end of empowering a decision because the final decision-making authority still rests with council. An example of that is around council remuneration. Oftentimes, councils don't want to set their own pay, and so they bring in an organization to help, or a group of people to help do some research and make suggestions. But finally, it's council that has to vote on the budget, and remuneration then is part of the budget. But they can at least consult broadly in the community to determine what the community thinks. So that kind of leads us kind of the end of this first mini section about legislation. The next one is about the difference between governance and administration. Before we go on, though, is there anybody who has any questions about any of the comments or points I've made so far? I don't see anything in the chat. If anybody wants to pipe up, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just kind of continue on.
Ian,
Yes,
it's Ron here.
Ron.
Just a question as to the code of conduct of a councillor interacting with a member of administration. What's
Okay.
the chain of command?
Officially, members of council have one employee. Council has one employee, and we're going to talk about that shortly, but that's the CAO. And they are not supposed to, council can't direct any member of staff other than the CAO. And council is best not to meet with members of staff or management without the CAO's knowledge or presence. So that is not, the comment you made, Ron, is one that we see happening fairly regularly if we're doing some sort of an investigation. It's often an end run around a CAO, and sometimes that's got something to do with a lack of trust in the CAO, factions on council, those sorts of things that happen, but it's not supposed to happen. Now, it's a small town, right? You still live in a community where you're going to run into members of staff at church or at the grocery store. And those conversations are okay there, but they can't be perceived or seen as directing members of staff or management.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, we'll talk about governance and administration. As I was working on this book that I referenced, one of the pieces that I began to see as I've dealt with hundreds of elected officials over the years is their rationale for being on council. And I kind of developed this continuum of service. And some people want to come onto council to serve, purely to serve their communities. They have been a member of the Rotary Club, they've been involved with the Chamber, they were in 4-H, they led Girl Guides. And this is just another natural step in the way they serve their community. So they are altruistically looking towards public service. At the other end are people who are more interested in being the boss, that they have been used to being in charge of things, whether it's their own business or something to that effect, and they're more in it for the reasons of self-service. And so this slide here is one of the major reasons that we're doing these workshops that we're doing, is trying to identify individuals' motivation for serving or wanting to serve on a council. Are you able to look ahead for 4 years and work with a group of colleagues on serving your community based on the attributes that we see here? So if you are a lone wolf that used to just get her done, council may be a tough slog for you because even the mayor has no more voting authority than any other member of council. So if it's a council of 7, you need 4 votes to pass anything. And some of you may have a question about why are councils an odd number, and I'll just mention that right now too. Under Robert's Rules of Order, which is kind of the default rules of order if your procedure bylaw doesn't speak to something, under Robert's Rules, it says that in order for something to proceed, a majority of the organization's leaders must be in favor. So if you have a 3-3, if you had 6 people on council, for example, a 3-3 vote would not be a majority of members in favor of something, so whatever it is would fail. If you have an odd number, say 7, it's unlikely that it's rare that you would get an even split. Sometimes you would, of course, if someone was sick or on vacation, or if someone had to recuse himself from a vote. But for the most part, you wouldn't be dealing with those votes that would come out even. So that's why councils, for the most part anyway, are odd numbers. It's also one of the reasons that in Alberta, voting is mandatory. If you don't vote on a resolution that you're entitled to vote on, that's grounds for disqualification from office. And there are a couple of reasons you can recuse yourself. One is if you are in something called pecuniary interest, which is a conflict of interest that deals with money, and we'll talk about that a little later. There's another way too, that if you missed part or all of a public hearing associated with something, you can't vote on it either because you don't have the background information. But anyway, the point being here is that as we look at this continuing service, you are looking at creating, or the town is looking at creating a team of people who are going to look after their best interest in the long run. So those who are able to work in a collegial atmosphere are ones who tend to thrive on council. Those who work with I know best, my way, the highway, tend to struggle on councils because they get frustrated. The other thing you see sometimes is those people not seeing anything that they want to get done, and just checking out partway through their term. Now that could be literal, that they decide, I'm not doing this anymore, they resign, and then you get a by-election. Or it could just be you've got someone on council who just isn't interested anymore. And if you look at the big city councils in Edmonton and Calgary, and if you followed any of those, you see members like that on both of those councils right now. So anyway, council has to be a team. The community brings together a group of individuals, whether they like each other or not. The community expects them to do the best for the community, and to look at results as shared results rather than just pushing. As for what it is that council does versus administration, this is kind of the big picture stuff. Council's in charge of the what, and administration's in charge of the how. So if you were to look at a strategic plan, the goals and strategies that are in there, they are things the council wants to see done over the course of a year or 4 years or even longer in some cases. Administration then takes what council's interested in and tries to and figures out how to actually do that. So what council sets is a vision for the community, what success looks like, say, in a generation from now, a mission for the community about how we're going to get there. And that could include values as well. And then the determination of policy. Again, so administration doesn't have to keep coming back and asking council the same questions again and again and again. Council sets governance policy, and with some help from administration, of course. And then there's a transition to administration and management. Their job is to carry out the will of council, so to enact that policy, to manage the town, to provide administration, and to deliver stuff. So to provide programs and services that people of Innisfail rely on, to provide the facilities and the amenities that they want or need as well, for the benefit of part or all of the community. So the metaphor we often use is council's in charge of steering the boat, and municipal and administration's in charge of rowing that boat. When people become a part of council, sometimes they come in with some knowledge, having watched council meetings over the years. Maybe they've been on council before. Maybe they've closely followed another member of council as a bit of an apprenticeship almost. Others come in completely green. They are looking at a way to serve their community. And maybe they've served in some of those boards that I mentioned before, like the church or the 4-H or whatever. They're used to doing stuff. And council means council has to change your perspective on council, from doing stuff to planning stuff. Council is responsible for governance. You look at your results in terms of outcomes, the change that you're looking to make over time within your community. If you look at what administration does, they're responsible for outputs, kind of how much or how many of something are they going to deliver over a particular amount of time. So as a governance board, which is essentially what a council is, you are the guiders of things. You are the head of the beast, trying to point in a particular direction and dragging the rest of the organization with you. So that vision, mission, and policy development that was on the last slide shows up here again. As opposed to the doers. Now, when you were part of 4-H, maybe you're selling chocolate-covered almonds, I don't know, but you were actually doing those sorts of things. Now you're supposed to be moving into the thinking role. The leadership, because you are involved in your community, is led by council, rather than having staff lead organizations. The caveat to this is, if council doesn't provide leadership that's sufficient to run the community, oftentimes administration is more than happy to fill that void. And that generates conflict sometimes between council and administration, when councils sometimes see administrators who they think are running the show, and they don't think they should be running the show, and sometimes that ends poorly. Planning shows up here too. Council is responsible for setting its vision and direction through a strategic plan. So what do we want to see done by the end of the term? What do we want to see done by the end of a generation? Knowing, of course, that no strategy survives first contact with reality. We didn't know what was going to happen with COVID a couple of years ago. Council still has to adapt to that. But what that means in a practical sense is that we can still have our eye on that future generation hence. We have just had to take a bit of a sidetrack for a couple of years but it doesn't mean we should lose track of that vision over sometime into the future. And there's a piece here about recruitment. Of course, you can't recruit yourself as a council. The only recruiting you do is, I suppose you could ask people to stand or to run for council the next time out. But council's recruitment job is just a single employee. It's their CAO, as opposed to a working board. When if you want to get off the church board, somebody probably asks if you've got any ideas of other people who could replace you. When I have seen councils operate, I've kind of developed this theory around the 4 buckets of council management, the stuff that council gets to deal with. If you look at legislation, they're to maintain the accountability of the administration through the office of the Chief Administrative Officer. They're supposed to create and evaluate and rescind policies and programs and other things that are required by statute. And those things will show up here. So the first bucket that council gets to deal with as it comes into office is stuff that's carryover from the previous council that is not quite finished yet. And a lot of that has to do with infrastructure. It could be a sewer project. In this case, it's a pump station. Maybe it's a rec facility. Maybe there are programs that are underway as well. But it's work that the last council started, or maybe even the council before that started, in terms of commitments that were made. The second bucket is work that gets handed to council from other orders of government. The example I use here is cannabis. Local governments in Alberta had no say over whether cannabis was legalized or not, and have no say about whether it can be used in town or not. But there's still a responsibility, now passed down from the federal government to municipalities, to manage it. So that's through things like zoning or changing smoking bylaws that they have to handle because they were handed that from another order of government. The third bucket that I see is around what I call crisis management. The pieces that you don't want to deal with but have to, because if you don't, nobody else is going to. We see this a lot in things like forest fires. I mean, if you ask the people in Fort McMurray or Slave Lake about this, they will have things to say. And if you ask people in southern Alberta about floods, they'll have things to say about that as well. So there's no way around managing this. And in fact, all municipalities have directors of emergency management within the staff to do this already. The fourth bucket is the fun bucket. And that's what members of council brought to the table, often in their platform or some other things. The things that they want to do to improve their community over time. I have yet to hear of a council member come into office on the platform of let's keep everything exactly the same for the next 4 years. They all want some sort of at least a little bit of a change mandate. And that's the stuff that's the fun stuff that you want to see done. That's the stuff that often shows up in the strategic plan. That it may be the things that I wanted to bring to the table and the things that I'm looking at building political capital around with some other members of council. When we think about the 4 buckets and what they actually mean, these are the things you need to look after. The interests of the entire municipality. So what may be good for your neighborhood where you happen to live may not be overall good for the community, but often you will find that the oath of office that you take is to the community as a whole or the community at large, not just to your street or your neighborhood. You need to avoid conflict of interest around money, which is pecuniary interest. We'll talk about that later again. In the legislation, you have to attend council meetings and you have to attend committee meetings. And really, that's about it. A caution here around council and committee meetings, though, is anytime you get more than half of council together, and you talk about municipal business, that's considered a council meeting. Even if it's not advertised, it's not happening in council chambers, it's still considered a council meeting, and this is a contravention of statute. So it's something to be avoided. Now, the four of you or 5 of you may get together and have a conversation about last night's hockey game, and that's okay. You need to police each other about expectations on this. You represent the community, whether that's internally or externally. Whether you serve on boards like the chamber board, or whether you make presentations to the Rotary Club, you're representing the community. When you attend provincial conferences or regional events, you're representing the community. And somebody mentioned too about professional development. I think Jason talked about this. There's a responsibility for members of council to maintain and increase their knowledge of local government. Your knowledge of what's happening in Innisfail is greater than anybody else in Innisfail. At least it should be, and we're going to talk about the in-camera portion of meetings shortly. And then avoiding focusing on a single issue. That single issue candidate or the single issue councillor could end up as a rogue member of council for most of the term if they find that they can't deal with their single issue. If they're one of those people who are primarily self-interested when they run and they have a single issue and they can't coalesce support around it, they will be endlessly frustrated on their time on council. So the best thing to do is to avoid that single issue as you go in. I think about this metaphor, the visual image of an hourglass when I think about the relationship between council and administration. Council, the citizens, of course, are in charge. If there weren't a group of people who lived in the same geographical area and decided to incorporate the town of Innisfail, there would be no need for a local government at all, no need for administrative structure, no need for services. However, the people do live there and do want those things, so they delegate day-to-day authority to a council of their peers or citizens who live in the community. So council's job is to provide for those people, and they aren't doing it full-time either. So they have hired an expert in the CAO who in turn has hired other experts. And those are the people who are actually delivering on what the citizens want through council's eyes. You already know this, but council has a single employee. Their job into the Act is every municipality in Alberta needs a CAO, Chief Administrative Officer. The job of council is to hire that person, to evaluate that person annually, and to replace that person when that needs to happen, either voluntarily or because the person has chosen to retire, which does happen. And the evaluation of the CAO every year is an important step because the term I like is what interests council fascinates the CAO. So if you are providing that kind of input to your only employee, you can get them moving in a particular direction. The annual goals for the CAO should be something that is measurable and that can be looked back on at the end of the year, so we can determine whether progress has been made. It's also important to look at that to determine whether the CAO and indeed the entire administrative body is carrying out the will of council. All other staff are led by the CAO. So the question earlier, I think Ron, comes into effect here, that council can't direct any other staff. The one that you likely have, well, there's probably a couple that you would likely have, you'd likely have an interaction with. One would be a support person to council or the mayor, who maybe sends out agenda packages and that kind of thing you'd be working with. The other is the clerk or the person who helps out with legislation. You probably have quite a significant relationship with that person. Avoid micromanaging operations. This is where a lot of councillors, if they're going to get into trouble, do get into trouble. Your job is to be the head of that beast, not the body. And the words we use here are keep your nose in and your fingers out. You're absolutely welcome to know what's going on in your community, but a lot of cases, things you may be asking about are not your job. An example of this in terms of micromanaging might be in the realm of finance. So the governance role of finance is different than the day-to-day role of finance. Your job is to set a budget and then to measure how well you are doing against that budget. So the variance on a regular basis. It's not council's job to be looking at a check register or to be looking at a bank reconciliation or to be approving invoices before they get paid. That starts to get into the realm of operations. So if we look at the typical structure of an organization, the top of it, or a municipal organization, these are the people who are involved in governance. These are the people who are involved in administration. And if you notice, the only overlap is the CAO. He or she is the person who is responsible to council, and everybody else in the organization is responsible to that person. So that's something that we do see in terms of role clarity being necessary. When we see things going a little bit sideways, this is where they tend to go sideways. Only council can direct the CAO, and council as a whole through a resolution. Doesn't mean, you can't ask the CAO for a copy of a report or something, but you can't direct action for the city or for the town that way. Council itself can't direct any other member of administration except through the CAO. If those end runs are done, the CAO doesn't know what's going on with council members. You end up with a very confused staff who doesn't really know what the boss is. We ran into an occurrence like this when we were doing some work in the Northwest Territories, where a municipality we were working with actually had set up a public works committee of council. So the public works director was responsible to the committee of council and responsible to the CAO. And the question became, well, who does the director really report to? And the poor director was stuck completely in the middle. In the end, the director was responsible to the CAO, and the committee was not able to direct that person. So if we look at ways of mitigating some of these hazards, policy setting becomes really important. We've sometimes run across policy that is 30 or 40 or 50 years old in a binder someplace. But what that tells us is these policies have never been reviewed. And if these, or not never, but not for many years have been reviewed. So if that's the case, what other things are there in that policy binder that nobody knows about? Because they're still on the book, so they're still legislatively binding. So without going through these policies on a regular basis, maybe the town isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. Council acting by resolution will get around the direction of the CAO, and will also get around directing staff other than the CAO. Because you are each other's team and can push back a little bit, maybe not in public, on each other, you can hold each other in check. And you can also ask your CAO to provide you with that feedback. The CAO, as a senior person in the town's administration, probably spends more time on town business than anybody else. And should be able to push to you or give you a call or a nudge and say, hey, that's none of your business. Perhaps not in those words, but at least to get the a council on the straight and narrow and focused on what they ought to be doing. So that kind of covers off a little bit I was going to talk about around the difference between governance and administration. And I'm happy to stop here for a couple of minutes if you like, if anybody has any questions. All right, seeing none, we'll just move on with expectations. Council, this is what council's responsible for. You set the vision for the community. You set the mission about how we're going to get there and a series of values or lenses through which you will make your decisions. You then create a plan out of that becomes a set of goals, change that you're looking for over time, over the course of your term, a set of strategies or actions or the things that you're going to do. And these strategies are often a list, when you go door to door or hear from your colleagues or your friends, voters about what they want to see done, often what they give you is a list of stuff. And that's a list, that to-do list becomes strategies to achieve something bigger. And your job is to think bigger. So combining a bunch of those actions or strategies into goals will eventually get you to where you want to be 4 years from now or a generation from now. On the back end of that is performance measures. If we can think about things in advance, how will we know when we have been successful? This gets back to perhaps some of that performance measurement for the CAO as well. If we've got performance measures in our strategic plan, if you like, or accountabilities or timelines, those sorts of things can be useful for the municipality to register progress, or for individuals within the municipality to register progress as well. So this is what it looks like as the plan. So council is responsible for setting vision and mission in the strategic plan. Then there's a transfer to administration. They'll often have a tactical plan or an operational plan that's linked to the strategic plan and achieving that. There may be individual department plans as well. Then there are some bigger pieces that are longer term around things like asset management or human resources or capital plans. And then the rubber hits the road with the delivery of the service to the people of Innisfail. And then a report back on that. And there's a feedback loop that builds into this so we can learn from what happened last year and hopefully make some changes for next year if need be. And of course, there's a budget tied to that. And even if you're not doing something like priority-based budgeting, there is, you do put money onto your priorities, even just unconsciously. I do recognize too, as we go through this, I'm kind of describing a bit of the ideal world. We did a session like this last week in Pincher Creek, and afterwards somebody said to me, what I'm describing is an ideal world, and what happens in reality is somewhat different. And I agreed, and I said that this is one of the reasons we're actually doing these candidate workshops, is so that people who are coming in can push a little bit higher for a greater standard of good governance. And if there's a positive culture to build on that, and if there's a negative culture to mitigate it, there's always room for improvement no matter where we look. And if there's willingness to do that, so much the better. You can move from good to great, as it were, as the book says. If you want to have a successful term of office, here are some of the things to think about. Excuse me. Being visionary, we've talked about quite a lot. Stay on that higher plane, stay out of the mud, keep your nose in, keep your fingers out. Work on policy. You can certainly ask questions about that. You're absolutely legitimately welcome to do that. Recognize that you are one member of a team of people who the citizens of Innisfail have brought together. It'd be useful if you knew each other as human beings and as family people and community members, rather than just people on a Zoom screen that you talk to once every week or two. Know that your interests, aptitudes, and values to some extent may be different than somebody else's. That you may have different, because they are different, there are strengths in that, but you kind of need to know where those differences lie. So you don't think somebody's just tweaking your nose and they're not really doing it intentionally. Which gets to communication. Communication one way, two ways, through engagement. And building bridges, I think that's one of the biggest jobs for council. And finally, know that the buck stops with you, that there is no other entity to whom to pass on. You can blame somebody else if you want, but that's not going to help. When you're out there in the broader environment, these are some of the hats that I've seen councillors wear. They're not just people who show up at a meeting every week or two, or more and more meetings. A lot of these people who are serving on councils have been around for a while and have served their community in a variety of capacities. So this kind of got this historic authority over time, that they know who's who in town and they know how to make things work. We've talked a lot about setting direction, because that's perhaps the biggest job for council, is looking at the long-term success of your community. Actively participating in meetings, whether those are internal meetings around council and committees, or whether those are external meetings, in the role that you may take with entities beyond the town corporation itself. Sometimes I see council members who just sit and listen and listen and listen and vote, and that's all, and I wonder what they're actually really contributing. Now, they may be doing something behind the scenes that I'm missing, but they're not engaging in that thrust and parry of debate that's going on in open session of council. You're a member of a council, the community's first team that the voters have chosen, and you're a regional representative, for better or for worse. You're contributing broadly regionally, and you're hopefully learning broadly regionally too. We have been involved in some situations where, in commissions, for example, inter-municipal commissions on various things like waste management or water, where a commission has asked that somebody not be reappointed from a particular municipality. And that's got to be a little bit embarrassing for that municipality, to have somebody who has not served that community well enough, to the point where they're being asked not to participate any further into the future. So this speaks a little bit about expectations. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments on any of that part. Okay. We'll move on to some of the pitfalls then. Oh, sorry, Todd, I didn't see your hand up there. I've only got some people on screen, not the whole lot.
It's okay, and I put it up a little bit late, but sometimes the question comes to me as a CAO, when can the hat of a councillor come off? Can I take my hat off momentarily to go do this and then put it back on? Can you maybe explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, for sure. You, as members of council, don't lose your rights, responsibilities as citizens or community members. So certainly you can take off any one or all of those hats if you're going to serve on a community organization or participate in some community event, as long as you're clear that you're not doing it on behalf of the town, and as long as it's not more than half of the town council who's actually doing it with you. For those people who have grown up in the community or have been there long enough that they're well known, that's often not a problem. For those people who are transplants or who nobody's ever heard of until they run for council, it can be a little bit of an issue to determine when they're acting as council and when they're not. Anybody who's a close family member or friend of that person probably knows that pretty well. But you certainly don't lose your rights as a citizen when you run for council too, when you serve on council. It's funny, I once ran for a council. I didn't make it, as it turns out, because now I'm doing this. And I had thought that putting my name on a ballot would give me every right to complain after the election, because I put my money where my mouth is. But I had found that it actually turned into people perceiving it as sour grapes. That my criticism as a losing candidate after the election was that he's just mad, he's just upset, he's just whining. And it probably took a couple of years for that to dissipate. So there's two pieces. One is as a successful council candidate and council members removing your hat. And one is as an unsuccessful council candidate, but what kind of an impact that has too. So just a bit of a peculiarity that I hadn't expected that I did find. Todd, is that all right? Yes, no? Okay, good. Okay. I will go on with role clarity. So can you do what you want to do? I've referenced some of this already, so I may go through this pretty quickly. And that is, you can't change legislation of the provincial or federal order of government, but you can have an impact on it. The groups like the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, or even regional government groups, regional local government groups, do have an impact on provincial and federal legislation. So while you may not be able to do something in terms of a bylaw or policy, you might be able to effect some change at a federal or provincial or federal level. The other piece to this is, if you are trying to solve a problem, are you solving the real problem or just a symptom of the problem? And just to be careful that you get upstream far enough that a change you make will have the desired effect downstream and not just come up with some sort of an unintended consequence. The role clarity about the I'm mad about something one issue candidate, we have talked about, as have we talked about building a team. The mayor in this case has no more authority on council than any other member of council. They have the same voting authority as anybody else. They're a community member like anybody else, but they are often a more senior member of council, and they are perceived as having more authority than other members of council, even if they don't. And that's moral authority rather than real legislative authority. If you were to look at too much American television, or have voters look at too much American TV, they have, in the States, they have something called the strong mayor system, in which case the mayor does have a lot more authority than the mayor does in Canada. It was kind of funny. We did a council orientation in the city of Wetaskiwin after the last election, and they have in their procedure bylaw, it says that the mayor isn't ex officio a voting member of boards and committees. Usually the mayor is a voting member, but this case he wasn't. So somebody joked that not only do we have the weak mayor system, we have the very weak mayor system in Wetaskiwin, which I thought was kind of funny. And the mayor, the new mayor at the time, took it to heart, and that was pretty funny too. I think some things are funny. The mayor builds a team. Well, and all council is responsible for building a team. Things like retreats become important. And I mean, by retreats, I mean spending that time together where you get to know one another. And if you're meeting in chambers as a retreat, that often doesn't work. Because in a town, somebody has to go home at lunch and walk the dog, or somebody has to deal with something at work. If you are interested in doing these retreats, my recommendation is to literally get out of town to do those sorts of things. And the final point on here around role clarity is being sure that you respect the roles that are given to you, that your staff are professionals and they are acting within their legislative authority. And some of them will be members of professional organizations and will be acting within their own code of ethics as well. This is a series of things we've seen as landmines within a council. A lot of these, again, we have made at least an oblique reference to already, about council just getting involved in the weeds and providing management rather than providing leadership to the community. A relationship between the CAO and council that doesn't work very well. When we find that councils and CAOs aren't getting along, oftentimes it's a new council or a new council since the CAO has come in. And the relationship issues tend to deal more with fit than they do with skill. A former council hired a CAO and things were going great with that council. The mix of people on that team changed, and now there's a conflict between the CAO and council. And it doesn't reflect badly on the CAO, it's just a question of fit rather than skill. The lack of consensus building has to do with nobody having any more authority than anybody else and needing a majority of votes to pass anything. Boards and committees, usually boards and committees have no authority to make decision or to spend money unless they are specifically delegated that. And committees of council, an audit committee, for example, would have to be created by bylaw. We are currently managing a committee for the city of Edmonton that has 28 members on it, and it's quite the onerous beast. And they really have to be clear on role. Overreacting, that sober second thought, is something that I think councils are pretty good with. We're going to talk about misuse of confidentiality and misuse of position as we talk about ethics. Favoritism comes in there, as do family ties. Sometimes we find in smaller communities where there has been a family that's run the town, or two families that have run the town for generations, those family ties and influences can be problematic for councils. I put a specific slide in here about social media, and I called it for better and for worse rather than or, because there is value to social media, particularly when it's used appropriately. However, every community in Alberta seems to have a Facebook rant and rave site, and very rarely are those people telling council how good a job they're doing. It's like the Senate that exists at the 7-Eleven or down at the coffee shop that meets on Tuesday mornings, the old guys who are hanging out, and again, not talking about common sense, not what council is doing. But you know that these tools are useful. Most municipalities, including Innisfail, have social media accounts. And if used just to communicate and push information, that's fine. But sometimes they're used to respond as well. So Facebook comments or response to tweets, those kind of things. Who's actually managing those? And if you have a personal series of social media accounts, would you also have a council social media account as well? And if so, would they be different? And do you react? Do you have an anonymous account that you just kind of troll on? Do you tolerate more online than you would in a meeting? Do you put up with stuff? Do you dish out more than you would? Always remembering that if it's an account with your name on it, you represent your municipality's reputation. A lot of municipalities, maybe including Innisfail, I'm not sure, have social media policies that govern how social media is used by the municipality, and also recommend, if not govern, how social media would be used by members of council too. The council, municipal and council sites or profiles are bound by bylaws and policies. Citizens aren't. Whether they're citizen groups or whether they're individual citizens, they're bound by law the same way anybody else would, but not by the higher standard associated with a bylaw or a policy. So if it's on behalf of the municipality, social media is bound by Voip as well. So social media records could be subject to a Voip request. If we start thinking about ethics and ethical quandaries, these are some of the things that we see. In fact, I do a whole workshop on this, an hour or two, on just these 3 points. Particularly in communities where municipal leaders aren't full-time or aren't compensated full-time, these things tend to happen. In this boiling frog scenario, you've probably heard it. You put a frog in, I don't even know it's true. You put a frog in cold water, you turn up the temperature, the frog doesn't notice, and then it boils to death. And by the time it's too hot, it's too late. So as an example, this shows up as, so somebody offers you, as a member of council, tickets to the local hockey team, value $5, $10, whatever. No big deal, you take those and you go to the hockey game. So that escalates a little bit, and somebody says, well, here's a gift certificate to a local restaurant at the value of $100. Okay, well, maybe that's okay too. Then he comes back and says, hey, how about I've got a villa in Mexico. Why don't you go spend a week there? Value of that's a couple of $1,000s. So at what point does that stop being ethical? I don't think anybody really has a problem with your $10 hockey tickets, but they probably would have a problem at $2,000 being spent on a trip to Mexico. Heck, look what happened with the Alberta legislature over Christmas. At what point is that water too hot? Do you have a policy on gifts? So what starts out innocently causes trouble. The mayor is a little bit different too, because oftentimes the mayor will receive gifts on behalf of the municipality. So the visiting delegation comes from Ukraine, gives you a nice piece of art worth a couple of $1,000s, but that doesn't stay with the mayor. The mayor receives it on behalf of the municipality and turns it over. So it's not quite the same here. So gifts are something to be careful about. The second one is around entitlement. You don't get paid a whole lot to serve on town council in Innisfail, particularly if you think about how much extra time you put into it beyond council meetings. So what does it really matter if I take those hockey tickets or if I take that dinner, particularly if everybody else is doing it? Which then gets into that not holding each other to account. So if members of council see other members of council starting to take advantage of these other ethical quandaries, can they call them to task? Should that be done in open session? Should that be done quietly behind the scenes? Know that you ought to be able to do that as somebody who's taken that oath of office, and recognizing that if one member of your council is branded as being profligate or of taking gifts when they ought not to, that's most likely going to blow back or at least reflect on the rest of you as well. This also becomes somewhat cultural, because in some communities this is okay. In some communities it's most definitely not. And sometimes candidates will think about it and say, I would never do something like that. 3 years in, they're beginning to see that sense of entitlement. 6 or 7 years in, maybe it's completely well grown. So just something to watch out in terms of ethical quandaries. When we as an organization are brought in to look in a municipality for something that's not going quite right, I'll tell you the first place we look is what was supposed to be confidential that isn't confidential anymore. This can be whispered conversations. It can be it can be those whispered conversations. It can be being overheard in the bar. It can actually be conversations that are malicious or malevolent in nature. It could be those little brown envelopes that contain some document that was discussed in camera has now been pushed under somebody's door, and all of a sudden, or the media's door, and now somebody knows something they ought not to have known. There's a reason that things are supposed to stay in camera. An in-camera is a closed session of council where all members of council are present, plus whoever council invites, again, usually the CAO and maybe one or two other people, depending on what the subject matter happens to be. So we're looking for what's not being kept in confidence. And this can be tit for tat as well. And note about those closed sessions that there are no notes to be kept, no recordings made, video or audio, and there's only one motion that's actually allowed in camera, and that's to come out of in camera. People can take notes during meetings. People can receive documents during meetings, those in camera, but they have to be destroyed at the end of it. And oftentimes somebody will collect those. The clerk might collect them, the CAO might collect them and shred them afterwards. Or if the CAO or clerk aren't there, a member of council will do it. There are reasons that you can meet in camera, and there are lots of reasons that you can't. The Voip says that you have to disclose unless there's a reason not to, and there are a list of exceptions to disclosure, things like that land, labor, legal thing. So third-party confidences, solicitor-client privilege, advice from officials, those sorts of things are legitimate reasons to have conversations in camera. I think some municipalities abuse that a little bit. You can see how much some municipalities do in camera and how much some don't. It makes me think that some of them spend too much time in camera. And it gets back to that principle of transparency about doing things in public unless there's a reason not to. And you, as members of council, should know more about your community than anyone, including your spouses, because they are not privy to that in-camera information either. If things go bad in a longer sense, there's a term called disqualification. This is set out in the Municipal Government Act. So there are reasons for a member may be disqualified. Essentially what it says is, if you are not, you are obviously eligible to stand for nomination at some point because you got nominated and you stood and you ran and you won. If you cease to be eligible to be nominated, you are disqualified. And some of the places that show up here are if you're absent for 8 weeks worth of meetings. Usually not a big deal because most municipalities meet quite regularly. However, sometimes in the summer where a municipality may not meet for a month or two, this can be problematic. And this is only to be absent without excuse. If you're sick, if you're studying somewhere, if something else has come up, or if you're representing the municipality somewhere, those are all legitimate reasons to be absent, although they do have to be excused by council so it's on the record. If you're convicted of an offense which carries 5 or more years of imprisonment, you are disqualified. Chances are, if you're in prison for 5 or more years, you're also going to miss 8 consecutive weeks of meetings, so you're kind of doubly disqualified. If you don't vote when there was no reason that you shouldn't vote, you're disqualified. And that I talked about that pretty early on. If you're in pecuniary interest, which means it's financial conflict of interest, and it means, are you making a decision which would benefit you, your employer, or certain members of your family? This could include spouses. It includes children, parents, not very many others, if any. There may be others as well. But it has to benefit those people. And it has to be a financial benefit. If you are unsure about whether something is a pecuniary interest or not, this is where you would get legal advice and rely on legal opinion. Because if you don't vote when you're supposed to, you can be disqualified here. And there is no such thing as perceived conflict of interest or perceived pecuniary interest. Either is or isn't, and that's where the legal opinion comes in. You're also disqualified if you create a financial liability or if you have a financial liability to the municipality. Typically, if you owe money to the municipality more than anything that's current, back taxes, current taxes, utilities, that sort of thing. and if you vote for inappropriate expenditures. If you vote, for example, to accept a grant to fix the roof of the curling rink, and instead you use it to pay for a spray deck, that could be grounds for disqualification. If you borrow money over and above the debt limit for the municipality, that too is grounds. So there's quite a few of these. But if you follow the golden rule for the most part, you're pretty good here. So you always just have to be ready or be eligible to be nominated again. If you are disqualified, however, and there's a by-election called, you in fact could run in that election and potentially get your seat back. That's not the same in other provinces. In Saskatchewan, for example, if you are disqualified from council for one of these reasons, I think it's like 12 years you can't run again for. You're disqualified for 12 years, which kind of makes sense to me, because if you did something, you shouldn't be able to come right back. Council can't vote to remove a member of council. What they can do is ask a member to resign. If the council member chooses not to resign, a judge can declare the seat vacant, disqualification and vacancy. I'm only aware of that happening once this year in Alberta, in a village just east of Edmonton, where a member was declared a seat was declared judicially vacant. And it was because of financial liability to the municipality, which stemmed from a dispute between the council member and the municipality. So to avoid some of these things, because I've talked about the bad stuff, to avoid some of these things, a lot of this has to do with culture. It's building a positive culture and doing it consciously. Sticking with the golden rule will get you where you need to be. If things are starting to trend poorly into that nasty cycle, breaking it is something that you ought to be doing to build that virtuous cycle. And that requires conscious effort of individual members of council, council as a collective, and the support of the organization. Just know that if council is not getting along with one another, that has an impact that ripples throughout the organization. Nobody wants to bring something to council if they think council is going to use it as a weapon against other members of council. Know that you are each other's first team. You know more about your community than anybody else. Treat that information with confidence and respect. You are there as delegates of the citizens of Innisfail, not just because of yourselves. Culture we've spoken about. Good, just because you do something that's not illegal doesn't make it a great thing to do. It just means you won't go to jail for it or get fined for it. So in this case, good is not just an absence of bad. It's actually striving to be better, to achieve the vision that you've set for the community. Creating what, do as I say, not as I do, gets to that sense of entitlement. And the last comment is very similar to the one I just made. When a person joins a council, they don't bring just themselves. They bring their families along too, for better or for worse. If your family is not on side with this decision, it becomes a really tough 4 years. So having those supports in place becomes important. And those will be people like your family and friends, colleagues at work, because most people will either be retired or have other jobs if they're serving on council. The municipal administration, not your friends, but sometimes but they are your colleagues and can provide advice as well. Previous, I've had board members here. I mean, that could be the community organizations you served on. It could even be former councillors who may be able to provide you with some advice. A note about former councillors, though, once they stop being council, they stop being privy to that information that's discussed in camera too. It's not uncommon for us to find a former member of council or a former mayor or a former reeve of a municipality who knows stuff that they ought not to know because a member of current council has confided in them and asked them their advice. I've mentioned this principle here about keeping municipal business public unless there's a reason not to. It's a philosophical principle, and it can be tough because not everything that council does is goodness and light. Sometimes it's not, you don't enjoy doing some of the things that you have to do, or accepting some culpability for things that may have gone sideways. But that's when this principle really gets tested. Following the spirit of the law is very similar to what that last slide said about just because it's legal doesn't make it right. So that talked a little bit about some of the pitfalls for councillors and candidates. The next piece is around expectations and the workload. And we have 20 minutes, half an hour left. Any questions or comments from anyone on anything thus far?
Yes, Ian, Don Harrison here. Just around the conflict of interest and the pecuniary interest, perceived and actual conflict. Did I hear you say that there is no perception of a conflict of interest, or is it just to do with pecuniary?
In the Municipal Government Act, the term conflict of interest doesn't appear. All the MGA speaks about is pecuniary interest, which is conflict of interest that just deals with money. And then for the most part, most conflicts of interest that you could define would be associated with money. And to that extent, it's a financial benefit to, just the limited number of people, the employer and close family members that have to benefit from the decision that you would make. So an example of that would be, say, a land division. If you owned a lot and you wanted to subdivide it into 2 lots, and you are a councillor, you couldn't vote on that because you would benefit from it. It wouldn't mean you still have the rights of a citizen. You would recuse yourself from the vote. You could still present to council as a delegation on that, but you would not be able to participate in the debate or vote on it. So there's no such thing as a perceived conflict of interest or a perceived pecuniary interest. And that can be a kind of a gray line, which is why, if it is gray, the recommendation about legal opinion shows up. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. And the second
Sure.
question I have, Ian, is who makes the call? Is it the individual that feels that they have a conflict of interest, or can a colleague say, excuse me, I think there could be a conflict of interest here? Who actually makes that call?
Ultimately, it's the individual who makes the call, yes or no, I will recuse myself or I won't. But in terms of collegiality, I think there is a burden on other members of council to point that out if they see it. Because it's quite possible that someone could have just missed something. I'll use an example of this, and Todd will be familiar with this one. We were looking at the use of pecuniary interest in Rocky Mountain House at one point. And there was a comment that came up about the mayor was in pecuniary interest because he voted on the lease rates or rental rates for hangars at the airport, which was owned by the town. He happened to have rented one of those hangars. And somebody just said, well, are you, Mr. Mayor, in a pecuniary interest? Because you're obviously voting on something that impacts you. And the result was, no, the mayor wasn't in a pecuniary interest because the impact was widespread. Anybody who rented a hangar at that airport would have been affected by that decision, not just the mayor. And that would be the same for you as members of council voting on tax rates, because that has an impact on you, a pecuniary interest on you, because it has an impact on how much money you owe to the town at the end of the year. Or fees and charges bylaws, anything that has to do with money could put you in a pecuniary interest, but because it affects the entire community or a large chunk of the community, it's not an official pecuniary interest from the sake of the act. Councillor, does that help?
Thank you very much, Ian.
Anybody else? All right, speaking about workload, I would invite current members of council to as we talk about this, to think a bit about what your reflection is on the work that you've had to do over the last 3 years and 6 or 7 months, and whether this is accurate, and just jump in on this too if you want to. So the Act says that you have to attend meetings, and that's it. If all you do is show up to council meetings and go home and do nothing else, you're okay. However, that doesn't really make you a very good community representative. You have other roles as well. So the work is what you make it. Some members of councils around this province will stick to that letter of the law, show up to council meetings, and that's it. You never see them out in the community or at events. But then there are the additional roles that aren't there, which do make you a good community representative. Things like attending those turkey suppers or Christmas dinners or high school graduations, cutting ribbons on businesses, that sort of thing. Engaging with the groups which are in your community, that thing about grassroots, about learning from the people who live there. Again, if there weren't people who lived in that geographical area, there'd be no Town of Innisfail. Communicating and engaging widely by putting out things like newsletters or blogs or keeping up with social media posts, telling people what's going on, informing them. Those are the things to me that make a good community representative. I'll tell you though, we were involved a few years ago in the city of Lethbridge. They were doing a review to determine whether council members should move from being part-time to being full-time, and then that would change compensation as well. The eventual decision that came back from a representative community group was council members would remain part-time because all they had to do according to the Act was the first pieces on this slide. Everything else they did was considered voluntary, and as such, the job was not full-time. So they did recognize that if the council members don't do this extra stuff, they're not being very effective council members. But it recognized that by the letter of the law, all they had to do was actually show up at meetings. The family comes into this as well because of the irregularity of the work that you do. Unless you're one of those people who just goes to meetings and you know how long that's going to take and how many days of the week it's going to use up, you don't really know your time commitment, or I don't know the time commitment for the average councillor in Innisfail. You guys probably know that way well. You would know it way better than I do. But you also know that your family has to support you. And because people like spouses and kids are part of the pecuniary interest legislation, you want to think a little bit about any issues of pecuniary interest which might benefit members of your family as well as yourself. And this might be one of those cases where one of your colleagues pulls you aside and says, hey, your kids are enrolled in or at school or something, and you want to build a new playground. Maybe you shouldn't vote on it. I don't know, something like that. So think about that. Family knows that the schedule is irregular and it often involves evenings and weekends on top of the work that you're already doing if you're employed. There's lots of hours of reading. I mentioned that 700-page council package. Todd, that's not a challenge, by the way, for members of council. Lots of hours of reading and material and preparation. And that may not just be reading. It may actually be phone calls or emails and conversations with one another. And in non-COVID times, there can be quite a lot of travel as well. I mean, you work in a pretty active region, or you live in a pretty active region, and I'm sure there's collaboration with other municipalities, as well as conferences and workshops and things like that that go on and get put on throughout the year. In terms of some of the things that you can expect, as you start moving into your council life, there are definite cycles that appear. The first is kind of after swearing in, that first month or so, so mid or late October to late November, you can go through some onboarding. And what the onboarding is here are the keys, here are the bathrooms, here are the staff, here's a series of briefing materials. It could be binders, it could be electronic files, maybe things like tablets that you get, or laptop computers, phones, those kinds of things. Just really getting you hooked into the structure of the municipality. And you'll be meeting lots and lots of people, some of whom you likely already know. Your single point of contact through the CAO will likely give you tours around facilities, help you meet some key community people, either within the town or beyond the town, and staff as well, because staff are always curious to see who the new bosses are going to be. Then you've got the orientation. This session today is kind of built on an orientation. Legislation says within 90 days of swearing in, the municipality has to offer an orientation to all members of council, and that swearing in could be a by-election as well as a full-on election. The interesting thing about that is the legislation says the municipality has to put on the orientation. It doesn't say anything about people actually having to show up. However, council codes of conduct often do say that there is a responsibility for members of council to show up to those orientations. Now, sometimes the orientation is almost always right after the election, within a few weeks. The good thing about that is it gets your blood going. The bad thing is it's at the same time a whole bunch of other stuff is happening, and it's tough to remember it all. You may get a binder or a handbook or something, but it's hard to remember. So I'm a proponent of ongoing orientations. You get fed by the fire hose on day number 10 of your term, but then maybe every month or every quarter or whatever, you do something that has to do with orientation. And it may even be a reminder. You will understand the different types of meetings that you have to take part in, particularly council meetings, whether they are regular ongoing meetings, whether they are special meetings that deal with a particular topic, whether they are in camera or whether they are open session. And you begin to understand the processes that hopefully legislative services or the clerk will help you work your way through. You start your meeting cycle, of course, and one of those early meetings will be an organizational meeting. And at that meeting, you will get things like board and committee appointments, which sometimes will just last for a year. Sometimes some of them will be for the full 4-year cycle. That organizational meeting will also include the schedule of meetings for the year, of regular meetings for the year, as well as probably a discussion or an agreement about seating order in council. And I'm a big fan of seating order that changes every 6 months or so. It will also talk about the deputy mayor schedule. So the mayor, of course, is appointed at large, but other members of council will act as backup to the mayor if the mayor can't attend a meeting or something like that, or is away on vacation. And those will rotate too. So everybody should get a chance or two to be deputy mayor through the course of the term. So through the first 30 days, all those sorts of things are going to happen. If you were to look at the first 90 days, inclusive of that, you will have the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association conference that happens. Usually, if it happens in person, it moves back and forth between Edmonton and Calgary. Sometimes sometimes urban municipalities will send delegates to the Rural Municipalities Association, the Rural Municipalities of Alberta Conference, or RMA. It's kind of the rural counterpart to AUMA. And sometimes counties, surrounding counties, will invite you as a guest. Early on in your term, it's just a quirk of timing that doesn't work to anybody's advantage. The fiscal year for the municipality runs January to December. And you want to try and approve a budget as best you can prior to the end of the calendar year for next year. So almost as soon as you come into office, you're probably going to get a whole bunch of documents looking at budget 2022, January to December. Part of that will be the discussion of tax rates, about what do you want to see as an increase, decrease, or keeping taxes the same for 2022. At the end of Q1, you'll be looking back at the last quarter for that governance level financial review. How are we doing versus budget for, well, it'll probably be for the third quarter of this year, is the first one that you would see. Then you would get a start on strategic planning, setting priorities for the following year. So there is a strategic plan. Do you agree with the priorities? Do you want to carry things forward? Are there things that you want to change? A previous council can't bind a future council. So you could conceivably throw that plan out the window if you wanted to, though that's not a good idea. Again, I like to suggest strategic planning that looks forward a year. I also promote meeting with your regional partners, other people from other local governments around the region, before you have issues that you have to deal with, to get to know each other as colleagues, as people, potentially as friends, and build relationships that way, before you're thrown into some sort of a melee about dealing with some inter-municipal relationship issue. So you'll meet those people. If you look at the one full cycle of everything, you would have gone through a calendar year at this point. That professional development that Jason mentioned shows up here. And in terms of professional development, some of it can be formal, and we would talk about more of this in detail at an orientation itself. But there are lots of programs out there that you can take advantage of. There's something called the Elected Officials Education Program, which is put on and co-sponsored by a number of organizations. There's a link to that later in this presentation that a lot of people will take. It's a series. Other municipalities will send counselors on various courses or programs of study, so long as they are relevant to the municipality. I've had questions about, I had a counselor who said, I want to take the ICD, or Institute of Corporate Directors, accreditation as professional development, and that didn't really seem relevant. Somebody else said they wanted to work on their registered parliamentarian certificate, kind of related. Somebody else wanted to go and take a course on priority-based budgeting through Augustana College. If you look at that, that's certainly is more relevant. So what's going to benefit council and the municipality is something you can think about in terms of professional development. But there should be a budget for ongoing professional development for council, and it should be used as you go throughout the year, upgrading your skills as you go. You could go out to these things, or you could bring people in. I know of municipalities that have brought in a registered parliamentarian to have a presentation to council. So those kind of things can be done, and they can be done individually, or they could be done regionally, however you see fit. Some of the bigger law firms in Alberta will put on a day seminar on current legal trends that sometimes elected officials will go to. Those are usually in Edmonton and Calgary. So that's part of that constant learning. At the end of your first year, you'll have everything under your belt for year one, and you'll start looking back at what did we get done, what did we not get done, and for that stuff we didn't get done, why not? Do a bit of an analysis on that, and then start looking at your priorities for second year. And this is when you're really starting to take ownership of the strategic plan, of your vision for the community. Every municipality has to go through an audit every year, and the job of council will be to choose the auditor and then to review the financial statements once they come back. That's the governance piece. Your CAO and Director of Finance will be much more involved in the audit than council will. The audit will come back with numbers to say yes or no, things are going as they ought to. And sometimes there are process audits too that suggest changes to the way things are done that will make the municipality operate in a better way. And finally on this is reporting. So you're going to report out to the community in some fashion. That may be newsletters. Again, it could be social media. Maybe Innisfail has a mayor's state of the town address once a year, pushing information out to the community. So this is just a little bit about workload and expectations for any members of council or the mayor. I don't know if anybody else wants to throw any comments into this at this point. Reality versus my ideal. Okay, if not, we will continue on. I would encourage anybody who's thinking about running for council just to reach out to those people you know, just to get some information about what's happening in the real world versus what Ian just told you. So here are a series of resources that are available to you. This is just a brochure we created at the request of another place that's kind of that first 30 days. On the back side of this brochure that we'll provide is a series of principles of good decision making that were developed by George Cuff, who some of you likely know, and who I work with quite regularly and has provided us with permission to use. Here are some of the links that you'll get to some of the legislation that we have referenced, and some information that's available on the town's website. There are all kinds of pieces around bylaws and policies that are available on the website, updates to the strategic plan, and the budget and audited financial statements have to be on the website as well. So anything that you're interested in appears there, along with a series of other documents as well that I noticed. Or there are some of these organizations that you might find useful. Alberta Municipal Affairs has quite a lot of information on how governments should run, as well as information on running for election, and they have got a candidate's handbook for 2020, which speaks about how to campaign during a pandemic. So that's kind of a neat thing if you haven't already got it. The Alberta Urban Municipalities Association and RMA both have good websites that speak to some current issues that are of interest province-wide that Innisfail may want to have some sort of a conversation about or some sort of an impact on. The Local Government Administration Association, or LGAA, is an association of government administrators, so people like CAOs. So if you're interested in knowing what some of the hot button topics are for those people who run municipalities throughout the province, this is a good place to look. The Umbrella Association for Municipalities, in terms of the political people, the elected officials, is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM. They have an annual meeting too, and have a lot of information on their website on national programs which local governments can take advantage of or feed into. They also have they have a board and a series of committees, and there are quite a few people from councils around Alberta who serve on some of those committees, and some of you might be interested in it as well. I referenced that elected officials education program, or EOEP, that's available. Another one that I just was thinking about is sometimes Augustana College of the University of Alberta puts on programs as well. I know Doug Griffiths does some work through them, and a colleague of mine by the name of Kelly Rudick, who's big into things like well-being and priority-based budgeting, also do some courses through FCM. Sorry, not through FCM, through EOE, Augustana College. A bit of additional reading if you're interested in some of the more long-form stuff. There are lots of books available out there about local government. Some of these are specific to Alberta, and some of these are more general. Some are new and some are old. Leonard Dale recently wrote a kind of a fun book about ethics in governance. He's out of Edmonton, so he's pretty current and pretty local. John Carver in 1990 wrote a book called Boards That Make a Difference, about policy boards, about the difference between policy and working boards. And it's really old, but to me, it's one of the kind of seminal documented reviews of how policy or governance boards ought to work. Doesn't always translate to government, but it's a pretty good one. George Cuff, who many, if not all of you will be familiar with, if not know, has a whole lot of books. He and I keep joking with him that I'm trying to catch up, but he's writing them just as fast as I am, so I'm not catching up with him at all. He's got another one in the hopper at the moment. He's written a lot of books, almost all of them on local government. He's got Cuff's Guide to Local Government Governance, a series of books that you can get through Municipal World, which is the same place you can get my book, Who's Driving the Grader, which came out through Municipal World this past year. Municipal World publishes a monthly magazine. I imagine that somebody in the town of Innisfail subscribes to that. George has a column in it. I sometimes write for it, and a series of other people do. So there are some columns and articles in there. And just a book for fun is Mayor's Gone Bad. It's a Canadian book that was published in 2015. It speaks to some of the things you ought not to do as a mayor of a big city. A lot of this is concentrated in Atlantic Canada, a lot of it in Montreal and Toronto, though there are some Western references too. It's just kind of a fun read. I suppose it's not fun if you lived in those communities and you knew what was going on, but it's a fun read that you can take advantage of if you like, and those sorts of things are all included. So we have about 10 minutes left. I just wanted to go through what we actually talked about. We talked mostly, almost exclusively, about the elected officials, mayor and councillor. We didn't talk much about municipal structure in terms of who's who in the zoo. You would learn that the day after you get sworn in or as part of orientation. We didn't talk much at all about the election campaign, and that was done consciously. Some of what we talked about was what the council wants, and some of what we talked about was how to be an effective representative to the community. We know that legislation that we talked about here is the same for all municipalities, but it also differs based on how you as an individual and you as a group of people interact with one another to serve the community. So you put flesh on those bones. And a final caveat on this is recognizing that this is the ideal state, and that what happens in Innisfail and other places is sometimes differs from that. The topics that are here on the right in this other sheet are kind of a sample of the things that we would typically cover in a municipal orientation come October or November. In fact, our latest orientation we have booked is actually November 30th, which seems kind of late, but it's for a municipality that wanted to book a little bit later to give their people some time under them. So that kind of covers everything that I wanted to provide to you. And I wanted to leave a little bit of time, so we have about 10 minutes left, and just would like to see if any of you have any questions or comments as part of what we've talked about, or you've had to listen to me talk about for the last almost 2 hours now. You've got your cameras on, so I can see that you aren't sleeping. So while I wait, and if there is something that's fantastic, my contact information is here. I keep telling people that one of the principles of my company is around wisdom. It talks about sharing what we know. And if you have questions about this or anything else, please do reach out through the email address or the website or the phone number. And I'm happy just to have a conversation. In fact, it's very rare that I would do a presentation like this and somebody doesn't call or email after the fact, and I quite enjoy when that happens. I'll leave it at that in case anybody has anything they want to say. Todd, Mayor Romain, if there's anything you want to close with, I think we're probably done. I will provide these slides to the town, and they can distribute them to you as well, along with that brochure that I mentioned.
Thank you. And you asked the question to council members if you wanted to share anything just on your experiences over the last 4 years. Maybe put that back to council members if you're willing just to kind of share what that life looks like, whether it's busy, not busy, or reading. Is there somebody that willing to kind of share your experience?
Sure, I'll go, Todd. I guess coming from a business background and being on lots of boards, what stands out to me is how slow things move in the municipal world. It took a lot of getting used to seeing in the business world, if in our company, if we want to do something, we could do it the next day. Even when we come to decision as council, working through the processes of procurement and different things, it's quite a different lifestyle. So it's a bit of an adjustment to get things done. I think that's something people need to be aware of. And I just had a quick look, our agenda for Monday's meeting is 181 pages. We get to read up on this weekend. So there is some preparation.
Oh, definitely.
There is some flexibility, and you can put as much into it as you want, or as little. But it's, if you don't put any effort into it, you don't get any reward either. So that would just be my comment.
Thanks, Cal. You're right too about the speed of government. People talk about, and I didn't mention it in here, about the principle about government should be run like a business. And I think government can run on business like principles, like efficiency and transparency and those sort of things. But it isn't a business because the return on investment is often social, whereas the return on business investment in a business like my own, for example, tends to be financial. I do think though that local government moves faster than the province or the feds. So if you're going to choose an order of government that you want to move quickly, this is the one.
This is Gavin. I'll make a couple comments. I agree with Councillor Rehberger's comments 100%. There's so much of it is a process. It's not just as easy as one might think. As far as busy, I believe it's gotten busier. And you are, to a certain extent, masters of your own destiny. If you undertake a lot of future endeavors, you're going to be busier. And we have done that. Would hope that, I guess, that we would continue to do that. Yeah, I think Councillor Rehberger covered some specifics there. Perhaps the mayor would even comment because he had a 4-year absence, and I'm betting he noticed different when he came back. That would be my invitation to have maybe Jim Romaine comment on that. Thank you.
Gavin, I think of course, one thing was the nice new chamber facilities.